And yeah, I think we can start at any point.
Great.
I guess. Yeah.
Do you want to host?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Pretend like it's your show that you're launching.
Yeah. There we go. So first, I wanted to say thank you for coming to our class, and it's been a blast for all of us.
You did pay me a lot of money, so
that reminds me. Okay,
yeah. You are paying me money, right? Just to be clear,
that's
is
true,
the check
right?
waiting? Yeah.
Yes, yes, it is. Yeah, we should go to my office after the show.
All right, just checking. Great.
Well, yeah,
it's been a pleasure. Thank you. You got a great class. You're doing a great job.
I mean, I really don't do anything. The students are awesome.
A lot of talent.
Yeah, I agree. Would you say so?
100%.
Yeah,
big time. I mean, Matt's already like blowing up on TikTok. So yeah, and then I thought that conversation with the girls was great too.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, because the first time that I think a lot of them when they were doing it, it was their first time doing podcasts.
Yeah, wow.
And then as soon as they started doing it, I was like, I don't need to tell you anything. You just bunch of naturals. That's you're great. Just doing it right. And not that I have a lot of experiences in that. So but
that's cool. I sort of I love that you guys are learning together to some extent. That's really fun.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of technical background, so
right.
I try to just help them with the technicality of putting things together, but I try to stay out of the content that they want to make in the podcast, so they can just go with whatever they want. So
definitely. Yeah. Well, it's great that, I mean, also, as you were saying, that people behind the scenes are doing a great job too. So that's
I'm very grateful for that. Yeah. So let's. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the book that I told you. I'm very excited about the book that you wrote about.
Cool.
I think the title was Music in Ancient Greece.
Yeah.
Melody, Rhythm, Life.
Well done.
Right?
I'm not sure I could have remembered that, but yes, absolutely.
I tried.
That's correct.
Before coming to the today's session. But yeah, and thanks, Marcy, for pulling it up. So tell me about it. Like, what? I mean, I'm planning to actually read that book at some point. But now that you're here,
Sure.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what's happening in the book? What did you cover? What did you find? What didn't you know that after you finished the book that you started understanding better about the music in that period of time?
Well, there's two things that I think a lot of people don't know, because most people read at least a Greek tragedy in high school, and we know Homer and the great works of Greek literature that are part of humanities curricula kind of across the country and the world. Most people don't realize that the majority of those literary texts are musical texts. They're not meant to be read in silence in a classroom. They are, the plays were all staged with music, so you're almost looking at something much more like an opera than, say, a modern stage play. And the Homeric poems, we think, we're pretty sure, were sung originally. And the melody may have been fairly simple, but it was still music. There was rhythm and melody as well as language. So that's the first thing most people don't know. The other thing most people don't know is we actually have sheet music from the ancient world. There was a music notation system. So the very first thing that most people used to ask me about is like, well, we don't know anything about what it sounded like. Wrong. We actually do know some basic things about the formal structure of Greek music, and then we have like fragments of melody. So our situation is sort of as if, 2,000 years from now, somebody dug up a Western music theory textbook, and along with that, you had a little scrap of paper that went dun 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 dun, and then it ended, and that was it. And so the question is like, could you figure out what the rest of Beethoven sounded like? Could you figure out that there was a Bach? Like, how much could you know? And that's basically what the book is about. It's about the state of our knowledge, kind of an introductory lesson, so that you can think about this stuff when you engage with it in a way that is like maybe more vibrant and exciting than we've been taught to think about it.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful. And then when you started researching that area, and in our conversation before we started class, you mentioned that there were period in ancient Greece where maybe after that were would they call it dark period in Europe?
The Dark Ages.
The Dark Ages, where they got rid of all the books, right? And a lot of the Greek culture and writings, we just lost them, right?
Okay.
And then we I think, based on what I understood, was that then later on, in Renaissance period, we started like reviving them through some of the translations that were handed to us from the Islamic golden age, right? And with that, first of all, I want to know if this is true, because I don't know. I read stuff off of the internet, and
Sure.
it's hard to verify that. But since you're the scholar of that period, I'd like to know about that from you. But also, how reliable are those revived sources? Like, can you really rely and say, okay, this was it? But because through translation, if it was translated to Arabic and then from Arabic to Latin, probably a lot would have been lost, right? Or not. What do you think?
Gosh, this stuff is so cool. This is catnip for me. So okay, you'll have to stop me when I get boring, because there's like so much good stuff here. So yes, again, in class, in school, we read like Homer, and we read Plato and Aristotle, and we have a canon of Greek literature. And what we don't always realize is that there's that's like the tip of an iceberg, and underneath the iceberg is this enormous volume of material that was all lost. So like Aristotle wrote dialogues. He had a symposium, just like Plato's symposium. There's an enormous Latin epic, the Annales of Ennius, that was before Virgil, the great epic that we now have, but totally gone. Famously, the Library of Alexandria had a big fire. That's where we lost a lot of material. But some of it's just like, technology was really limited for copying things down. You didn't, you had to rely on some monk somewhere to write things out by hand if you wanted material. And so this produces a million different problems. First of all, it produces the tantalizing possibility that we could rediscover some of this stuff, and right up until the high Renaissance, people were uncovering. Petrarch found the letters of Cicero just sitting in a library somewhere, and it's not impossible that there's more stuff like that out there. But also we have these basically trash heaps. Like we have, there's one very famous one at Oxyrhynchus where people were just throwing away, their receipts and their bills of goods. And on the back, it's like, oh, I guess on the back, this is just a scrap of a play by Euripides, so people are still finding that. There's a new Euripides fragment, currently making its way through the journals. And this was the subject of my research, Pompeii, buried under ash, Mount Vesuvius erupts, buries the whole place. Well, the B-side Pompeii, the one that people don't talk about as much, is Herculaneum, another city that was also buried under the ash. In Herculaneum, there is a villa. It's called the Villa dei Papiri, the House of Papyrus. And in the 1700s, archaeologists found this villa, and they found an enormous library just sitting there. Some guy, L. Calpurnius Piso, has a nice, well-stocked library, and we think, amazing, right? Here's this guy who has all of the text, or maybe some of the text at least, that we want. He might have Ennius, he might have more by Aristotle, he might have all this stuff, but it's charred. It's like a cake of ash, basically. And so for hundreds of years now, people have been trying to figure out ways of picking that stuff apart and unraveling it. And there's all these different technologies. At first, the people that uncovered it were cutting into this stuff with knives, so just devastating. You want to go back and be don't touch it, wait until we have x-rays. But now we have x-rays, and AI is actually doing a lot of stuff where you'd be able to find. So there's actually new stuff coming out all the time. It's one of the most exciting times to be a classicist right now, probably in the last 100 years.
Was there things related to music stuff as well that was discovered lately?
Yeah. So we have music theory more than music notation.
Yeah.
Philodemus, who is an Epicurean philosopher, did a lot of books where he just tried to refute all these other philosophers. And so his works, which are in the Villa dei Papiri, contain quotes from all these other people, like Diogenes of Babylon, that we just wouldn't otherwise have. And Diogenes was a Stoic music theorist, so we have a lot of Stoic music theory that we didn't have before.
It's Stoic music theory is the equivalent of ambient music these days.
No, I don't know what's ambient music.
Well, it's just a lot of chill music. You listen to long 50 minutes to 1 hour. You listen to it, and you're supposed to really meditate or not really think about anything by just being in the moment. I don't know. Sorry, it was.
No, that's funny. It's like, yeah, I mean, my buddy sent me this YouTube playlist of like, the videos are called like, I am Marcus Aurelius meditating upon virtue. And it's like, wah, and you're like, listen, like, yeah. But no, that's not so. So music theory is a lot about emotion. And actually the Greeks were very, very concerned with how music affects us emotionally because, I mean, people know you turn on a song in the car and suddenly you're back to high school and that one girl that you got with and like whatever, the breakup that you had. And so this is basically what guys like Plato are talking about with this, it's sometimes called the ethos theory or the affective theory of music. And so a lot of that has been recently uncovered. The really exciting one, and it's not that new, but it is exciting, is this papyrus with a fragment of Euripides, a play by Euripides, and it has music notations on it. It's called the Vienna Papyrus.
Really? Like the modern music notation, or
no,
the old music notation that you explained?
Yeah. So the way it works, and I know I can get technical with you. So Greek scales are based on tetrachords, like our scales. You have a fourth stacked on top of a fourth, and unlike us, unlike American music, Western music generally, you can either separate the 2/4 by what is it? I guess
like a step or a whole step.
A whole step, right? And that makes our standard scale. But you can also just layer them on top of one another, so that the top note of the bottom fourth is the bottom note of the top fourth, and then you have a not an octave but a seventh, and that's your scale. And then within the tetrachords, they would bend and move the pitches around so they weren't locked in like they are on a piano keyboard. So there's like a million different shades and the way they would represent this is they picked letters of the Greek alphabet to stand in for the notes, and then they wrote the letters over the words, and that tells you what note to sing on the whatever. So roughly speaking, that's kind of how it works, and that's what we have for Euripides. And we have like one snatch of the chorus from Orestes, where they're singing about how the Furies are tormenting the main character Orestes. Like it's got like this very kind of frenetic, vibey beat to it. A lot of unanswered questions. Is this the original music, or does this come from a later performance that was written down? We're not totally sure. Also, how certain can we be, because there are so many possible, right, like permutations within each scale, how sure are we that we've got exactly the right intervals and all that stuff? All of that open to questioning. But I always think about it a little bit like, they found not too long ago traces of paint on the sculptures that we have from antiquity, some of the sculptures we have from antiquity, and suddenly it was like, oh, we know these sculptures as the classical white marble
but in fact they were painted.
Yeah, in fact they had color on them, and so now people have tried to kind of like imagine what that color would look like. And is it identical? Who knows? But this is sort of the same thing. It's like a guess at what the soundscape would have been like.
Oh, you just
exactly. And it looks, to me, it looks really weird to see it that way.
Wow.
But yeah, a lot of this would have been that way, because you can see the traces even on the left side. You can see that there are traces of
traces there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So with the modes, and you said we can get a little bit technical, right?
Please.
So I remember when I was reading about that stuff a little bit. Somebody, like one of my professors, I guess in my grad school, told me that the Greek modes that existed back then is different, or are different from the church modes that later on were used in the medieval and Renaissance period. First of all, is that true?
Yes,
and then if it's true, how are they different from each? Was it just like labeling them differently, or the content of the modes were also different?
So there is a relationship, but yeah, they're totally different. So a modern mode, a Greek, or rather a church mode, tell me if I'm wrong, but it's basically a way of arranging the standard scale. So you have the classic, is it Dorian? No, it's
Dorian.
Okay, so you have the classic
do,
one.
Re, mi, fa, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, te, do. That's
right.
Dorian.
Okay.
Right.
So but basically it's like if you have your standard, piano scale from C to C, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, you make the notes by starting on a different note. So if you started on mi or re, then you would, and go up to the next mi or re, you have a different mode. That is distantly related to the way that the Greeks eventually found of moving from mode to mode. So, the key changes that they were able to do were sort of like that. But their modes were much more varied because it wasn't like there was one standard scale that they were messing around
So they were
with.
not set in stone. They would just
Yeah.
they were more modular. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and you'd bend the pitches, so there were quarter tones that we don't even hear as in tune. Like they
Yeah.
had notes in between our piano notes, basically. And they used to talk about them in terms of chromata, which means colors, shadings. And so, there are 7 of them now. Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian. They're named actually after
The places.
yes, tribes, ethnic.
Oh,
they're
they're
ethnic
tribes. Yeah,
names,
yeah.
but yes, tribes that lived in places. And
Places,
so
yeah.
it's like ethnic. It's sort of like if I said like this is an Indian rag, they would say this is a Phrygian tune, and
Yeah.
they each had these sort of characters and emotions associated with them as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So it's very different from those modes, the ones that we have. I mean, because we had the revival of using the church modes in 20th century again,
Yes.
like in neoclassicism, right? With like Stravinsky,
Yeah.
and Prokofiev, all those composers, they started using those modes again, and as a result, we started using them in popular music, like with Beatles and the Beatles and other, and up to this day we still use them. But it's nice to know that these are probably very different from those classic modes that but sometimes we refer to.
Yeah, I mean, in music specifically, music history, we have our own Dark Ages. That's not the same as what we talk about. I mean, when we say the Dark Ages, we usually mean like the medieval period.
Yeah.
But our latest Greek music, like written down Greek music, is a Christian hymn, and I believe it's from the 3rd century AD. So we're talking like early church stuff, and that in itself to me is awesome that we have that. Like the oldest Christian hymn is a Greek music notation papyrus, and then like everything kind of goes dark until Gregorian chant, which is the beginning of like Western music history. And the only connection between the two is that our music notation, the actual like staves and notes, is originally based on Greek pitch accents. So if you look at a written piece of Greek, there are little markings over the vowels. There's an acute accent, there's a circumflex accent, and then there's what looks like a grave accent. And these actually originally would have told you where to move the voice, even while speaking. So it's not meninaedethea, it's meninaedethea. Like it's got like a kind of lilt to it. And so those accents used to show direction of tonal travel, and slowly they turned into like a more developed system of showing like, oh, you move from here to here, or you move 3 intervals up, and that's where you get those like Gregorian chant manuscripts where you have, I think it's called plain chant or something, and you have basically like the contours of the melody without any specific absolute pitch. And then once you put the stave behind that, you've basically gotten all the way to music notation. So there is that relationship, but in terms of like the actual music theory of it, there's like a big gap where we don't really know what exactly happened.
Because I know Pythagoras,
Yes.
right? Like he had a lot of writings about music theory and intervals and harmony, the way that we understood harmony with ratios and all of that. So going from there to where are you saying that there is a gap?
Oh, well, so this is, okay. First of all, Pythagoras, like Socrates, never actually wrote anything down himself. He
Really?
He was famously.
know that.
The word esoteric
Okay.
comes from the idea of the esoterikoi, which in Greek means the people in the inner circle. And Pythagoras is kind of like the OG esoteric, because
Okay.
there was like a veil, and he would teach his closest students.
So yeah, he's okay. So it looks sort of like Fernando de Saussure, that all of his writings are from his students. Basically.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Much like Socrates.
Yeah.
And so you have the Pythagoreans, and actually the Pythagorean music theorists are a big influence on Plato. So we get a lot in Plato about music and kinds of modes, and it seems like in particular this one guy Archytas is like a big influence on Plato in that way. So there's plenty of writing about that sort of stuff. Although again, this is much earlier. This is like 3rd, 4th century BC, right? But yes, Pythagoras or the Pythagoreans theorized the scale in a way that we don't really know of in the West outside of that. You know, India, the East is totally different question. But like, there's a famous story that Pythagoras was walking past a forge one time,
and with the animals like guts and all that.
Animal guts, or there's different versions of it.
Yeah.
One way we know it probably didn't happen is that if you tried the experiment on the anvils that is described in the texts, it wouldn't actually work. But the basic idea that these are mathematical ratios
right.
is very important to the Pythagoreans, because it meant that it was connected somehow to like the order of the universe, right? The fact that the fifth and the fourth are like baked into mathematical relationships. And of course, as you know far better than I, like it doesn't quite work out that way. And so you have to like invent a clavier and do a bunch of stuff to like make tuning work. But long story short, like all of that is a continuous tradition. What's discontinuous is the actual practice. Is like we don't have music notation between that 3rd century AD hymn and the development of like modern music notation. So we don't know what those songs would have sounded like.
And then going back to, this is fascinating because I actually read some of, like, I don't know, do you know some of the scholars of like the Golden Age, like Islamic Golden Age? No, by the way, like I kind of like don't like they call Islamic because a lot of those scholars are Persians and Egyptians and Africans. And there are, I mean, I might be wrong. I want to know what you think about that. There were times that
that's true.
They were kind of, I mean, it was the scholarly language, obviously, because of the caliph at that period. But I think there were fear of maybe execution or prosecution if they didn't write in Arabic. So, and as a result, they got full credit for it. Is that true, or it was more all consensual? Or
no, I think, and I'm going to get my caliphates wrong, but I think it's the Umayyad Caliphate maybe where this stuff starts to get going. And it's really a question of conquest and patronage more than like Islam Islam does in some of its varieties encourage natural science and philosophy and these sorts of things. But as you say, it's not like some of these great scholars were themselves devoted Muslims. It's more that they operated and moved within a world that was getting conquered by Muslims, and some of the caliphs were benevolent toward them. And so what we call the Islamic Golden Age really is in fact more about like the motion of texts, right? So it's you have what we talk about as our Dark Ages, a term we've now used several times that I don't actually really like very much because like lots was going on in the Christian West during the medieval.
What's your preference?
Medieval. Even that is
more historical,
biased,
right?
Yeah. But there was a book that came out. I haven't read it. It's apparently kind of not that good, but it was called The Bright Ages because it was about this period being actually full of artistic flourishing and stuff. But it is true that knowledge of Greek in the West declined in a big way and didn't really return to what had been the Roman Empire until the fall of Constantinople. And that's when like a lot of these, there was kind of like a flourishing and a renaissance of Greek learning. Meanwhile, this is kind of the golden age. This is kind of the Islamic Golden Age. And so they're able to support a lot more. And this is when you get like, oh gosh, I'm going to forget the name, Avicenna and...
that's a Persian scholar. I wanted to actually... Al-Farabi is another one.
Al-Farabi is a big... Yes, that is a major source for music theory.
For music theory, yeah. And I was thinking like as you were, looking at those materials, I don't know if you've ever...
only Al-Farabi and a little bit of Al-Haytham because I'm interested in optics.
But I checked out Farabi's at some point in the grad school, and he does have like tetrachords. Yeah, he does have like the sort of like the localization of the theory that they got from the Greeks probably, and he became like more innovative about it, and he created his own like tetrachords, and like there was not a lot of like scales back then, but also the quarter tones that you just talked about, because as you know, like in Persian culture, quarter tone still exists in traditional Persian music. They have all these tones in between the tones or larger than the tones that we know, and it is based on if you go up to climb up the harmonic series, if for example the fifth is based on the third and the second ratio, those intervals are based on higher intervals, like the 11th, for example. It becomes a little larger than the tone. And but there were also back then there was also notation in those books that I looked at, but the notation was not maybe similar to what you're talking about, but it's based on the alphabets.
Yes.
Yeah,
right.
is that the same thing that you were talking about?
You know, I actually don't know whether Al-Farabi is using what we get in part from Aristoxenus, who is a 3rd century BC. I think I'm getting that right. 3rd century BC music theorist. He's got a treatise that we rely on for a lot of this stuff. And my guess is that what you saw in Al-Farabi is from Aristoxenus, but I actually don't know.
It could be. Yeah, I don't know. Cool. So maybe to wrap up our conversation, give a chance to Andrew maybe. So when you look at the history, one of the things that I'm interested about, and sort of in line with what I'm doing in music as well, and also media, is that you see these periods of, going back to classics, right?
Yeah.
Like, for example, again, we have the Greek 3rd and 4th BC culture, and then it was flourishing and it disappears, and then we have the, centuries after that, people didn't care about it as much. And in the Renaissance, we had this period where we go back to that stuff and we try to discover them, try to revive them. You fast forward to 20th century, but in art, at least in music that I'm more knowledgeable about, we have the neoclassicism, right?
Yes.
So it was like you want to go back to the classics and pull from that, and so many interesting stuff happened there. And now you talk about, like, in your book, the second book that you wrote, what was the title of the second book?
How to Save the West.
Yeah. So do you think there's a chance that in 21st century also we would have some kind of a new classicism, and that's sort of the starting of it?
This is really, really interesting. Well, so my short answer is yes. My long and very tinfoil hatty hot take grand theory of history answer is that what we call the Renaissance, which means rebirth and is a recovery of pagan antiquity, is basically the church. And you know who invented the term Renaissance?
No.
Okay, so Giorgio Vasari is the author of basically the first art history, comprehensive work of art history. It's called The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. And Vasari is looking back on, at the end of the kind of high Renaissance, looking back on what has just happened, this radical transformation that has just happened in art. And he says something at the beginning of that book that is still one of the most profound and daring things anybody's ever said about the Renaissance, which is the Christian church, when it was first established as a political force in Rome, had to sweep the decks clear of paganism, because paganism was still a going concern. Like, there were still people that believed in Aphrodite, and so you had to just absolutely put your foot down. And this is where you get the early church's very dogmatic and definite anti-pagan literature. And they had to do that because they needed, the Church of God had to establish its foothold and make absolutely clear that this is the one truth. And as Tertullian famously said, Christians are right, pagans are wrong. But, says Vasari, in doing so, they cast way too wide. By definition, they had to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so they lost, for instance, many sculptural and figural techniques that actually were really great, and they kicked them out because there was they're using this to paint nymphs and whatever, and so all that information, all that knowledge got lost. And that is where you have what Vasari calls the maniera greca, which is Byzantine art, where nobody knows how to do anything. They don't know perspective, they don't know sculpture or whatever. And he says, and what happened, the reason there was a rinascita, a renaissance, is because we've just started rediscovering all of those techniques, and the church is now in a powerful enough position politically that we don't have to be afraid about the return of paganism. So we can borrow the good stuff of paganism without worrying that it's going to reignite the worship of Aphrodite.
And hence the Christmas day. Is that a pagan?
Christmas is that's a whole separate can of worms. Christmas is not a pagan holiday, but that is but
the
yes,
date
but
of it,
the
25th, I guess, wasn't.
Augustine, we're getting sidetracked, but the 25th of December is recorded as a date from 358 AD, I think. So it's much earlier than this period. but yes, like in general, not being afraid of like pagan adjacent stuff is really like what makes the Renaissance. I think that if you take all of that information and you apply it to our moment, our version of pagan antiquity is actually medieval Christendom. Because after the scientific revolution, when people were starting to like throw out Aristotle and the scholastics and say, no, actually there's like Newtonian physics, with the Enlightenment, you have this very strenuous rejection of everything medieval in the same way that we had. And this is where you get the idea of the Dark Ages, that this was dark compared to the Enlightenment, in the same way that the church was like casting out all of this pagan, quote unquote, garbage. The Enlightenment thinkers cast out all of this medieval, quote unquote, garbage. They didn't want the superstition. They didn't want the
religious, maybe
the religion and the closed-mindedness and all of this stuff. And they cast the baby out with the bathwater. I think there's like an enormous spiritual significance to like medieval allegory and symbolism that is just now starting to come back, because we live in such a scientific age that we're not actually worried that we're going to turn back into like medieval clerics. But what we really stand to recover is the medieval way of thinking, and that we're on the verge of a medieval Renaissance. That's my answer to your question.
All right, that's fair. Well, thank you so much, Spencer. Yeah,
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again. Yeah.